There are large framework differences between the .NET Framework and .NET Core. As you can see right here in this diagram, we have a hypothetical application called My Application. And in between that item, we have the .NET CLI, which is the new command line interface associated with .NET Core. So the interaction with .NET Core can be utilized through the commands of the .NET CLI, and .NET Core is manipulated and executed and managed through the Core CLR. Now, the framework differences between .NET Core and the .NET Framework is the CLR itself, the Common Language Runtime, which associates the management of the execution of code for any language that you're implementing utilizing the .NET Framework itself. And the main difference between the two is that the Core CLR is primarily made for .NET Core and for implementing an execution that runs across all different platforms. Now, before .NET Core, we had Mono. Mono was utilized to create .NET applications on different cross-platform environments. But by default, it was not supported by Microsoft. Microsoft support and implementation of cross-platform applications is associated with the .NET Core framework. The .NET framework must run in a Windows environment, is usually tied to Windows OS. Here are some app differences between an ASP.NET Full Framework app and an ASP.NET Core app. In a Full Framework app, the root folder is your app. There is no default blacklisting or whitelisting of folders and files. In ASP.NET Core, you have the www root folder, that everything inside of that root folder is whitelisted and you're able to access. Everything outside of that is blacklisted by default. So there's a layer of security associated with whitelisting and blacklisting files by default. Visual Studio dependency is sometimes necessary to create a full .NET framework. It allows a lot of functionality by default to manage and execute and test a full framework app. With ASP.NET Core, there's a lot of support outside of Visual Studio. You also have Visual Studio Code. You can use the .NET CLI to create console apps. So there's support outside of Visual Studio itself. The system.web.dll is necessary for your full framework apps if you're building web applications. There's no system.web dependency inside of ASP.NET Core. So all of that older code that is necessary to run inside of the .NET Framework is not necessary inside of your ASP.NET Core apps, which make them much more performant than full framework apps. For configuration in a full framework app, you have the web.config and XML. Now inside of .NET Core, we utilize a project.json. You can also use XML or an INI file. It allows different type of configurations to associate inside of your application. The full framework app does not allow dependency injection by default. You can incorporate DLLs associated with Ninject to do dependency injection. With .NET Core, dependency injection is built into your startup.cs file. Your full framework app is tied to your configuration, and that configuration is typically tied to IIS, which is your web server. In .NET Core, we are decoupled from the configuration file itself. It tries to be more of a standalone platform, and your application can run standalone by itself. You'll typically tie it to a web server. The web server is very flexible to associate in different environments. So this is a nice aspect of ASP.NET Core. The largest difference between the two is that the full framework app is not cross-platform, and ASP.NET Core is cross-platform, meaning it can run on Mac OS X, Linux, and Windows. So in the next lecture, we're going to actually examine the differences between .NET Core and a full framework app in Visual Studio.